The entire ballroom fell silent when Scarlett Davenport deliberately poured a glass of champagne down the front of Madeline Brooks's dress. Laughter erupted around the room. After all, Madeline was only the nanny, a clumsy, curvy woman who looked painfully out of place among New York's wealthiest families and world-famous supermodels. Scarlett smiled confidently. She expected Enzo Morelli to be embarrassed. She expected him to send the nanny away. Instead, the ruthless Mafia boss rose slowly from his seat. Then, in front of every guest, every model, and every powerful family in attendance, he draped his own jacket around Madeline's shoulders and asked a question that stunned the room. "Who gave you permission to humiliate someone who belongs to me?" Because while countless beautiful women had spent years trying to win Enzo Morelli's attention, he only had eyes for his daughter's clumsy nanny. 3 weeks earlier, Madeline Brooks stood outside the iron gates of the Morelli estate, clutching a worn handbag and silently praying she wouldn't ruin the opportunity before she even stepped through the front door. She needed this job, not wanted it, needed it. Her father, Oliver Brooks, had suffered a serious back injury nearly a year earlier. Medical bills had piled up faster than the family could pay them. Her younger sister Ruby was working double shifts at a diner just to help cover rent. Meanwhile, Madeline spent most of her time bouncing between temporary childcare positions that never lasted long enough. Not because she wasn't good with children. Because adults rarely gave her a chance. At 28 years old, Madeline had heard every insult imaginable. Too big, too awkward, too plain, too much. Eventually, she stopped arguing. It was easier to smile and pretend the comments didn't hurt. The massive gates slowly opened. Beyond them stood a mansion, so large it looked more like a luxury hotel than a family home. Madeline immediately felt out of place. Her affordable department store dress suddenly seemed cheap. Her worn shoes suddenly seemed embarrassing. And when she accidentally stumbled on the front steps while entering the mansion, she knew the universe was already laughing at her. "Great start, Madeline," she muttered under her breath. The head housekeeper led her through endless marble hallways before stopping outside a playroom. "You have exactly 1 hour," the woman warned. "If Isabella likes you, you'll stay. And if she doesn't?" The housekeeper gave her a sympathetic look. "You'll be nanny number 14. Madeline's stomach dropped. Inside the room sat a small, dark-haired girl, coloring alone at a table. She didn't look up. She didn't smile. She didn't acknowledge Madeline's existence. The little girl simply continued drawing. Several minutes passed in complete silence. Madeline nervously shifted her weight. Nothing. More silence. Finally, she sat cross-legged on the floor nearby. "That's a dragon," she said. "No." The response came instantly. "It's a dinosaur." Madeline nodded seriously. "My mistake." Another pause. Then the child finally glanced up. "It's not a very good dinosaur." Madeline leaned closer. "Honestly, I've seen worse." For the first time, Isabella laughed. A small laugh. But a real one. And somewhere outside the room, an unexpected witness had just stopped walking. Enzo Morelli stood in the hallway. He had come expecting another failed interview. Instead, he heard something he hadn't heard from his daughter in months. Laughter. The ruthless Mafia boss remained motionless outside the doorway, listening, watching, and wondering why the curvy, awkward nanny everyone would normally overlook had accomplished more in 10 minutes than 13 professional nannies had managed all year. Within days, the entire mansion noticed something strange. Isabella Morelli was happy. The little girl who had spent months throwing tantrums, refusing meals, and driving away every nanny suddenly wanted to wake up early. She wanted breakfast with Madeline. She wanted story time with Madeline. She wanted Madeline involved in everything. Nobody was more surprised than Madeline herself. Unfortunately, her growing bond with Isabella didn't make life inside the mansion any easier. If anything, it made things worse. Because Madeline remained exactly who she had always been. Clumsy. Painfully clumsy. On her 4th day, she knocked over an expensive flower arrangement while reaching for a storybook. On her 6th day, she tripped over a decorative footstool and nearly sent herself crashing into a priceless antique cabinet. The staff tried not to laugh. Some succeeded, others didn't. Madeline pretended not to notice. Years of being the target of jokes had taught her how to smile through embarrassment. But the moment that truly humiliated her came 1 week later. Enzo was hosting an important lunch meeting. Several business associates were visiting the estate. Madeline had been instructed to bring refreshments into the garden terrace where the meeting was taking place. Simple enough. At least it should have been. She carefully carried a tray of drinks through the open doors. 1 step, 2 steps, 3. Then Isabella unexpectedly ran toward her. "Madeline!" Startled, Madeline turned too quickly. The tray tilted. A glass of orange juice slid directly across the silver surface. Time seemed to stop. The drink spilled straight onto Enzo Morelli's custom-tailored charcoal suit. The terrace fell silent. Every employee froze. One of the guests actually gasped. Madeline's face turned crimson. "Oh my God. I'm so sorry. I am so sorry." She reached for napkins, dropped them, bent down to grab them, accidentally bumped the table. A second glass tipped over. The situation somehow became worse. Several people exchanged amused looks. One businessman smirked openly. Madeline wanted the ground to swallow her whole. She already knew what came next. Termination. Embarrassing termination. The same ending she had experienced countless times before. Instead, Enzo calmly stood. Everyone watched, waiting. The feared Mafia boss looked down at the stain, then at Madeline. Then something completely unexpected happened. He bent down and picked up the fallen glass himself. "It's fine." The terrace remained silent. Madeline blinked. "What?" "It's juice," Enzo said simply. "Not a gunshot wound." A few guests laughed nervously. Nobody knew how to react. Madeline stared at him, confused, grateful, embarrassed, and strangely emotional, because she couldn't remember the last time someone had shown her kindness after a mistake. Most people showed annoyance, disappointment, mockery, but not him. Later that evening, after Isabella had gone to bed, Madeline sat alone in the staff kitchen, replaying the moment over and over. She didn't understand Enzo. Everyone described him as ruthless, dangerous, cold. Yet every interaction she witnessed seemed to contradict that image. Unknown to her, Enzo was experiencing his own confusion. From his office window, he often watched Isabella playing in the garden. For years, his daughter had looked lonely, broken, still grieving the loss of her mother. Now she smiled constantly, and every smile seemed connected to one person, Madeline Brooks. The more Enzo observed her, the more he noticed things others ignored. The way she always let Isabella choose the games. The way she listened carefully whenever someone spoke. The way she treated housekeepers and security guards with the same respect she showed everyone else. There was no performance, no hidden agenda, no attempt to impress him. and perhaps that was exactly why he couldn't stop noticing her. Unfortunately, someone else had started noticing her too. And unlike Enzo, she wasn't pleased. Scarlett Davenport stood across the ballroom at a charity event 3 nights later. Tall, elegant, beautiful. Everything society considered perfect. For years, everyone assumed Scarlett would eventually become Mrs. Morelli, including Scarlett herself. But tonight, she watched Enzo spend more time speaking to his nanny than speaking to her. And for the first time, jealousy began turning into something far more dangerous. A plan. Scarlett Davenport had spent 3 years preparing to become the next Mrs. Morelli. At least in her mind. She came from one of New York's wealthiest families. She was beautiful, sophisticated, educated, the type of woman society considered perfect. Every public appearance had been carefully calculated. Every charity gala, every dinner, every family event. Scarlett had positioned herself beside Enzo whenever possible. The problem was that Enzo never seemed interested. Not in her. Not in anyone. For years, she convinced herself he simply wasn't ready. Then Madeline Brooks arrived, and suddenly Enzo was paying attention. Not romantic attention. Not yet. But attention nonetheless. And that was enough. Scarlett viewed it as a threat. The first attack came quietly. One afternoon, Madeline entered the staff dining room and noticed conversations abruptly stopping. Several employees exchanged awkward glances. Others avoided eye contact altogether. Confused, she sat down. A younger maid finally leaned closer. "You should ignore it." "Ignore what?" The maid hesitated, then handed over her phone. Madeline's stomach dropped. A photograph filled the screen. It showed her struggling to carry several grocery bags while leaving a local market. Someone had taken the photo from an unflattering angle. Cruel captions accompanied it. Comments mocked her weight, her appearance, her clothing. Hundreds of strangers were laughing at her online. Madeline immediately knew who was responsible, but proving it was impossible. She quietly handed back the phone, forced a smile, and excused herself before anyone could see tears forming. That evening she locked herself inside her room. The humiliation hurt more than she wanted to admit, because no matter how strong she tried to be, old wounds never completely disappeared. Years of ridicule had left scars. Some people simply knew where to cut. Across the mansion, Isabella noticed something was wrong immediately. "Why is Madeline sad?" Enzo looked up from his paperwork. "What do you mean?" "She's pretending." The little girl frowned. "But she's doing the fake smile." The comment lingered in Enzo's mind. Later that night, he reviewed security reports inside his office. One detail caught his attention. A private investigator hired by the Davenport family had been seen near the estate several times that week. The timing felt suspicious. Very suspicious. The next morning, his concerns deepened. Madeline accidentally left her tablet in the library. A notification appeared on the screen. More cruel messages. More photographs. More public humiliation. Enzo's expression darkened. By noon, his security team had identified the source. Scarlett. The realization should not have surprised him. Yet it did. Not because Scarlett was innocent, because he couldn't understand why she felt threatened by a nanny, unless she had noticed the same thing he was beginning to realize himself. That Madeline mattered. Far more than she should. For the first time since his wife's death, someone had brought warmth back into the mansion. Someone had restored laughter. Someone had healed part of his daughter, that he could never reach himself. That afternoon, Enzo found Madeline in the garden, helping Isabella build a crooked birdhouse. One side leaned noticeably lower than the other. The roof looked unstable. The paint was everywhere, including on Madeline's nose. Isabella giggled. Madeline laughed too. The sound hit Enzo harder than expected. Neither woman noticed him watching. For several moments he simply stood there, observing and understanding something uncomfortable. Every glamorous woman he had ever met wanted something from him. His power, his money, his influence, his name. Madeline wanted none of it. She cared about Isabella, nothing else. And that made her different. Dangerously different. Because genuine people were rare in Enzo Morelli's world. Very rare. The realization became impossible to ignore several days later. Enzo returned unexpectedly from a business trip. As he entered the mansion, he heard voices from the kitchen. Madeline was speaking with Isabella. "I don't like my freckles." The little girl's voice sounded small. "Why not?" "Because they're ugly." Silence followed. Then Madeline gently lifted Isabella's chin. "Listen to me." The child looked up. "Anyone who makes you feel bad about something you can't change isn't someone whose opinion matters." "But what if lots of people say it?" Madeline smiled sadly. "Then lots of people are wrong." Enzo froze. The words weren't meant for him. Yet they struck deeper than any conversation he had experienced in years, because he suddenly realized Madeline wasn't talking about freckles. She was talking about herself, a woman who had spent years being judged, mocked, overlooked, and still somehow remained kind, still somehow remained compassionate, still somehow chose softness over bitterness. For the first time, Enzo stopped seeing her as Isabella's nanny and started seeing her as a woman, a beautiful woman. The realization terrified him. Unfortunately, Scarlett chose that exact moment to escalate her campaign. An invitation arrived the following week, the annual Morelli Family Foundation Gala, the most important social event of the year. Every influential family in New York would attend. Scarlett personally volunteered to organize it, and secretly, she had already prepared a very public humiliation for Madeline Brooks. One that would either destroy the nanny's place inside the Morelli household forever, or force Enzo Morelli to reveal exactly how much she truly meant to him. The Morelli Family Foundation Gala was the kind of event people spent months trying to get invited to. Politicians attended, business tycoons attended, celebrities attended. The grand ballroom of the Manhattan Crown Hotel glittered beneath crystal chandeliers worth more than most homes. Madeline never should have been there. At least that was what she kept telling herself while staring nervously at her reflection. She had spent nearly an hour debating whether to attend at all. The invitation had come directly from Isabella. The little girl refused to accept no for an answer. "You have to come." "Why?" "Because you're family." The words still echoed in Madeline's mind as she entered the ballroom. Immediately she regretted it. Every woman in the room looked flawless. Elegant gowns, perfect makeup, perfect bodies, perfect confidence. Madeline felt painfully aware of every curve, every insecurity, every reason she didn't belong. Across the room, Scarlett Davenport smiled. Her trap had been carefully prepared. For weeks she had quietly encouraged gossip. She had planted stories, whispers, rumors, questions. Who was the nanny? Why was she always around Enzo? Why was Isabella so attached to her? By the time Madeline arrived, half the room was already watching, waiting, judging. The evening began politely enough. Then the comments started. Subtle at first, cruel beneath the surface. A socialite glanced toward Madeline. I thought staff entrances were around back. Her friends laughed. Another woman smiled sweetly. Oh, don't be rude. I'm sure she belongs here. Every event needs childcare. More laughter. Madeline forced a smile, pretended not to hear, pretended not to care. Inside, each comment landed like a punch. Across the ballroom, Enzo noticed. His jaw tightened, but Madeline kept moving, kept smiling, kept refusing to show weakness. The situation worsened when Vincent Davenport joined the attack. Unlike his sister, Vincent preferred direct humiliation. He approached while several influential guests stood nearby. So you're the famous nanny. Madeline offered a polite nod. Vincent looked her up and down. Slowly, deliberately. The silence itself felt insulting. I have to admit, this isn't what I expected. Madeline knew exactly what he meant. Still, she remained polite. What did you expect? Vincent smirked. Someone a little more. His eyes drifted toward her figure. Presentable. The surrounding guests laughed. Madeline felt heat rise into her face. Embarrassment, anger, shame. Years of painful memories rushed back. School bullies, former employers, strangers online. The same cruelty, the same judgment, different faces, same wounds. She turned to leave. Then Isabella appeared. The little girl had witnessed everything. Her eyes filled with tears. Stop being mean. The room fell quieter. Vincent laughed. I'm not being mean. I'm telling the truth. That was the wrong answer, because Isabella Morelli adored exactly one person in that room. Madeline. And anyone hurting Madeline instantly became her enemy. The child grabbed Madeline's hand. Let's go. Madeline squeezed gently, trying to calm her, trying to avoid a scene. Scarlett watched the exchange with satisfaction. Everything was progressing perfectly. Then she launched the final attack. A waiter approached carrying champagne. Scarlett intercepted him. Moments later, she crossed paths with Madeline near the center of the ballroom. The collision looked accidental. Nobody could prove otherwise, but everyone knew. Champagne exploded across the front of Madeline's dress. Gasps echoed. The room turned. Thousands of dollars worth of designer fabric dripped with sparkling liquid. Madeline froze. Scarlett covered her mouth dramatically. Oh my goodness. I'm terribly sorry. The apology sounded rehearsed. Insincere. Cruel. Several people laughed. Others looked uncomfortable. No one intervened. Madeline stood completely still. Humiliated. Trapped. She wanted to disappear. She wanted the floor to open beneath her. Years of insecurity crashed down at once. For a brief moment, she genuinely considered walking out. Maybe everyone had been right. Maybe she didn't belong here. Maybe she never would. Then something changed. The laughter stopped. Not gradually. Instantly. Because someone had stood up. Enzo Morelli, the most powerful man in the room. The conversation died. The music seemed quieter. Even the waiters froze. Enzo walked directly toward Madeline. Not Scarlett, not the guests. Madeline. His expression revealed nothing, which somehow made him even more terrifying. Scarlett's confidence faltered. For the first time that evening, uncertainty appeared in her eyes. Enzo stopped beside Madeline, looked at the champagne stain, looked at her trembling hands. looked at the tears she was desperately trying to hide. Then he slowly removed his jacket. The entire ballroom watched. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. And when Enzo draped the expensive jacket across Madeline's shoulders, a shockwave seemed to pass through the crowd. Because everyone understood what they were witnessing. Not kindness, not courtesy. Something far more dangerous. Protection? Enzo finally turned toward Scarlett. His voice remained calm. Deadly calm. Who gave you permission to humiliate someone under my protection? The silence that followed felt endless. And for the first time all night, Scarlett Davenport looked afraid. Nobody spoke. Scarlett felt every eye in the ballroom turn toward her. For years she had been one of the most influential women in New York's social circle. People feared offending her. People competed for her approval. Yet standing beneath Enzo Morelli's gaze, she suddenly felt very small. I asked you a question. Enzo's voice remained calm. That somehow made it worse. Scarlett forced a nervous laugh. It was an accident. Nobody believed her. Not even Vincent. The silence itself became an accusation. Enzo looked at the champagne glass, still resting in Scarlett's hand. Then at the stain covering Madeline's dress. Then back at Scarlett. You should apologize. The words were simple, but everyone understood what they meant. Enzo Morelli was choosing a side, publicly. Scarlett's smile disappeared. You can't be serious. Enzo said nothing. Scarlett glanced around the room. Surely someone would support her. Someone would intervene. Nobody moved, because everyone knew a dangerous truth. When Enzo Morelli made a decision, arguing rarely ended well. I said apologize. The second command landed harder than the first. Scarlett's face reddened. Humiliation flashed across her expression. Not because she had hurt Madeline, because she was being corrected in front of hundreds of witnesses. Finally, she looked toward Madeline. The apology sounded forced. I apologize. Madeline shifted uncomfortably. She never wanted this. Never wanted revenge. Never wanted public humiliation. Even for Scarlett. It's okay, she said quietly. But Enzo wasn't finished. His eyes moved toward Vincent Davenport. And you? Vincent visibly tensed. The entire ballroom watched. You insulted a guest in my presence, Vincent swallowed. It was only a joke. Enzo's expression hardened. The weak often hide cruelty behind humor. Nobody laughed now. Nobody even breathed. Because every person in attendance understood exactly what was happening. The Davenport family was losing. Publicly, spectacularly. Across the room, Margaret Morelli observed everything carefully. As Enzo's mother, she knew her son better than anyone. She had watched countless women attempt to attract his attention. Models, actresses, heiresses. He ignored all of them. Yet tonight he looked ready to start a war over a nanny. Interesting. Very interesting. Meanwhile, Madeline wished she could disappear. The attention felt overwhelming. The whispers had already started. Guests were exchanging theories, speculation, questions. Why was Enzo protecting her? What was happening between them? How important had she become? The evening might have ended there. But fate had one final surprise. As tension settled, Isabella suddenly climbed onto the stage. The 6-year-old had apparently escaped the supervision of 3 different security guards. The microphone squealed. Guests turned. Enzo immediately looked concerned. Isabella. But the little girl had already grabbed the microphone. I want to say something. Laughter rippled through the crowd. The child looked directly at Madeline, then smiled. A huge smile. My daddy says brave people should tell the truth. The ballroom grew quiet again. Nobody knew where this was going. Unfortunately, Isabella did. And Isabella had never cared about social rules. Madeline is my favorite person. A few guests chuckled. The little girl continued. She reads stories when I'm scared. She stays awake when I have bad dreams. She makes dinosaur pancakes even when they look funny. More laughter. Warmer this time. Genuine laughter. Tears began forming in Madeline's eyes. She had no idea where this speech came from. But Isabella wasn't finished. Everybody always says Daddy protects me. The child looked toward Enzo, then back toward Madeline. But Madeline protects both of us. Silence. Powerful silence. The words hit harder than anyone expected, especially Enzo, because he realized they were true. Madeline had protected Isabella from loneliness, protected the household from grief, protected pieces of their family that had been quietly breaking apart for years. The little girl pointed into the audience, directly at Madeline. She's family. This time nobody laughed. Because the child had unknowingly spoken the truth everyone was beginning to recognize. Madeline Brooks was no longer staff, no longer just a nanny, no longer invisible. She mattered, and the most powerful family in New York had just acknowledged it publicly. The applause started slowly. One table, then another, then another. Soon the entire ballroom erupted. Standing ovation. Madeline stood frozen, overwhelmed, embarrassed, emotional. Across the room, Scarlett looked devastated, because she finally understood something. She had spent years trying to impress Enzo. Madeline had spent months caring for the people he loved, and that difference was impossible to compete against. Yet the biggest surprise of the night still hadn't happened. As the applause faded, Enzo stepped onto the stage. The ballroom immediately quieted. Everyone watched, waiting. Curious. He approached Isabella first, kissed the top of her head. Then his eyes found Madeline. For several long seconds he simply looked at her. The room seemed to disappear. The guests, the music, the lights, everything faded. There was only her, the curvy nanny who never chased him, never impressed him with beauty, never tried to win him over, yet somehow had become the most important woman in his world. Then Enzo extended his hand toward her, in front of everyone, and said 5 words that sent shockwaves through the ballroom. "Come stand beside us." For a moment, Madeline couldn't move. Hundreds of people were staring at her. The most powerful man in the room was standing on stage with his hand extended toward her, waiting. The old version of herself would have refused, would have hidden, would have convinced herself she didn't belong. But Isabella's excited voice broke through the fear. "Come on, Madeline." The little girl bounced up and down. Madeline laughed through tears, then slowly stepped forward. The ballroom remained completely silent as she climbed the stage. Every eye followed her. Every whisper stopped. When she finally reached them, Isabella immediately wrapped her arms around her waist. The crowd smiled. The image was impossible to ignore. The feared Mafia boss, his daughter, and the nanny who had somehow become the center of both their worlds. Enzo looked at Madeline, really looked at her. Not with pity, not with obligation, Not with gratitude. Something deeper. Something that had been growing for months. You changed this family. The microphone amplified every word. The room listened carefully. When you arrived, Isabella barely smiled. Madeline glanced at the little girl. Emotion tightened her chest. She was hurting. Enzo continued. And honestly, so was I. A ripple of surprise moved through the audience. Few people had ever heard Enzo Morelli speak openly about his feelings. Almost nobody had heard him admit weakness. Yet tonight he seemed incapable of pretending. You walked into our lives expecting to work for us. His eyes never left hers. But the truth is, a small smile appeared. You saved us. Madeline's eyes filled with tears. The ballroom disappeared. The applause, the guests, the cameras, everything vanished. Only his voice remained. Because nobody had ever said words like that to her before. Nobody had ever made her feel important, valuable, needed. For years she had been overlooked, dismissed, judged before people even knew her. And now the one man whose opinion somehow mattered most was telling the world exactly who she was. Not a nanny, not an employee, not a joke, a person worth seeing. Across the ballroom, Scarlett finally understood she had already lost long ago. Not tonight. Months ago. The moment Isabella trusted Madeline. The moment Enzo started respecting her. The moment genuine kindness defeated manufactured perfection. No amount of beauty could compete with that. No amount of status could replace that. Scarlett quietly stood. Without a word, she left the ballroom. Vincent followed shortly after. For the first time all evening, nobody paid attention. Because the story was no longer about them. It was about Madeline, and everyone knew it. Several weeks later, life inside the Morelli estate felt completely different. Laughter echoed through the hallways again. The staff seemed happier. Isabella seemed brighter. The mansion finally felt like a home instead of a monument to grief. One Saturday afternoon, Madeline sat in the garden helping Isabella paint birdhouses. Some things never changed. Paint somehow ended up everywhere. On the table, on the grass, on Madeline's sleeve, even on her cheek. The little girl burst into laughter. "You did it again," Madeline groaned. "I am beginning to think I might actually be cursed." "Definitely cursed," a familiar voice spoke behind them. Madeline turned. Enzo stood nearby. His expression softer than she had ever seen. Over the past few weeks, moments like this had become more frequent. Breakfast conversations, evening walks, quiet talks after Isabella went to sleep. The walls between them had slowly disappeared. Neither had rushed. Neither had forced anything. The connection simply grew. Naturally. Steadily. Real. Enzo sat beside her. Close enough for their shoulders to touch. Madeline's heart immediately accelerated. Some reactions never changed either. "You know," Enzo said, "I spent years surrounded by people trying to impress me." Madeline smiled. "That sounds exhausting." It was. He laughed quietly. Then his expression became serious. "They wanted my money, my influence, my last name." His gaze met hers. "You were the first person who cared about none of those things." Madeline looked away. Suddenly nervous. "You make me sound better than I am." "No." His answer came immediately. "I think you've spent your entire life believing you're less than you are." The words hit harder than he realized, because they were true, painfully true. Years of criticism had created a version of herself she no longer questioned, a version built from insecurity, fear, self-doubt. Enzo gently took her hand. The simple gesture felt more intimate than anything else. "You know what I see when I look at you?" Madeline swallowed. "What?" "I see the woman who brought my daughter back to life." His thumb brushed softly across her hand. "I see the woman who walks into every room expecting judgment and chooses kindness anyway." His voice lowered. "And I see the woman I haven't been able to stop thinking about." Madeline's breath caught. Everything became still. The garden, the wind, the afternoon sunlight, even time itself seemed to pause. For months she had tried not to hope, tried not to imagine impossible things. But now those impossible things were looking directly at her, and they were real. Enzo leaned closer, not rushed, not demanding, giving her every opportunity to pull away. She didn't. Their first kiss was gentle, soft, quiet. Nothing like the dramatic romances people wrote about. It was better because it felt safe, honest, earned. When they finally pulled apart, Isabella's voice exploded from across the garden. "I knew it!" Both adults jumped. The little girl stood triumphantly beside the birdhouses, hands on her hips, looking entirely too pleased with herself. Madeline buried her face in her hands. Enzo laughed harder than she had ever heard, and Isabella looked delighted by both reactions. Months later, guests attending another Morelli Foundation event witnessed something remarkable. Madeline Brooks entered through the front doors. Not as staff, not as a nanny, but as an honored guest standing beside Enzo Morelli. Nobody laughed, nobody whispered, nobody questioned whether she belonged. Because she did. The woman everyone once overlooked had become one of the most respected people in the room. Not because of beauty, not because of status, not because of power, because of character. And in the end, that mattered more than anything else. Sometimes the world becomes so distracted by perfection that it overlooks what is truly valuable. Enzo Morelli had spent years surrounded by women everyone admired, yet the person who changed his life was the one everyone else ignored. The clumsy nanny, the curvy woman who never tried to impress him, the woman who simply showed up, cared deeply, and loved without conditions. And that was exactly why she became impossible to replace.